Good afternoon, and welcome to Radical Love or Recolonization, Why Theory Matters. Let me jump right in. Radical love, a commitment to the liberation of the otherness of the other, a recognition that there is no other. It is an act of courage, not of fear. Love is a commitment to others. This I've taken from Bell Hooks, Paulo Freire, and Cornel West. Love is not often a word we speak in restorative justice education, let alone radical love. Colonization or recolonization, starting with the word colonization, the process of assuming control of someone else's territory and applying one's own systems of law, government, and religion to it and its people. Recolonization, doing it again and again and again and again and again and again to the same people. We need to face the fact that because the dominant way of being in this world is to establish power over, restorative justice education will need to fight hard against this. And then why theory matters. I'm sure we've all heard, skip the theory, just tell me what to do, as if what one does is disconnected from theory. Like the foundation of a house, if it is splitting, weak, uneven, we would be crazy to keep repairing the warped floors, leaking roof, and cracked walls, hoping the foundation would repair itself. We need to identify theory and its counterpart philosophy clearly if we want to ensure restorative justice education will not cause further harm. In a world that has elevated empirical data and relegated discussions about what it means to be human to the realm of people's private lives, even when we use the right words like relationship and power with, it is likely we no longer understand what these mean. Welcome. My name is Dorothy Vandering. I'm presenting today in hopes that what I have to share will ignite difficult, honest conversations that are long overdue. In particular, I'm coming today as a settler Canadian of European origin, a white advocate of restorative justice education, inviting other white restorative justice education advocates to do some serious soul searching about our engagement with restorative justice thus far. It is my premise that we are ignoring the very core of what justice is, and as a result, all of our talk about relationships and needs-based practice is simply a smokescreen for believing some people have earned the right to control other people. I've been trying for years now to be explicit about this. Some of you have read my early work, but over and over again, I hear, see, and feel fear that will all be lost unless someone takes control and stays in power. Does it sound harsh? Does it hurt to hear that after all you've done to ensure a better way? The only reason I pose this question is because since I've begun my work in restorative justice education 15, 20 years ago, I've not been able to rest. And this is not because it hasn't transformed my life and the lives of many of my family, friends, and students, but because it is a constant battle to ensure that the dominant, hierarchical, neoliberal, imperialistic mindsets of the systemic structures that have been created mostly by people like and including me are at the ready to undermine and eradicate the radical love that is at its center. It's time to look in the mirror. Do we really care about liberating the other from otherness, or are we working to hold on to our kingdoms? It's time to recognize that schools are oppressive systems and people can change them, and those people are us. I want to tell you a little bit about where I'm from. Yes, I'm on the edge of North American continent, out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. And yes, I know this map is upside down, but is it really? This presentation is all about rethinking how we see the world, how we see each other. This is a map that might be a little bit more familiar to you, and this is where I live, at the very tip of the North American continent in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. This is a little town that I live in, just a little bit north of St. John's. It's called Pooch Cove, and we are the first to see the sun in North America. This is what it looked like here about 2 weeks ago. This is what it looks like more today, except for it's a little bit wetter. And this is what it looks like in the fall when I get to do one of my favorite activities, which is blueberry picking. Now, we all have a story. We all have a story that has actually led us here today to this conference and to this presentation. And today I share some of mine in hopes that it will encourage you in your work, but also support you in critically reflecting on if what you are doing is what you think you are doing. In a chapter that will be published soon, I begin with this paragraph. My biggest fear in life is to cause others harm. Yet I know that in spite of this fear, without a doubt, I will do so. Along with everything beautiful that makes me human, this is a given. It comes from the opportunity I've been granted in my createdness to be free. My next biggest fear in life is to be harmed. Yet I know that in spite of this fear, without a doubt, I will be harmed. Along with everything beautiful that makes others human, this is a given. It comes from the opportunity we've been granted in our createdness to be free. Because we are free to make decisions, and because as human beings, we are not perfect, causing harm and experiencing harm are inevitable. We've been taught to fear harm. And I would say at the core of colonization is a desire to be in power and then also fear that losing of power. What would happen if instead of fearing harm or loss of power, we shifted our focus and learned what it means to be human and how we can use our freedom and imperfection to meet together in authentic relationship that embodies radical love. Rumi, a 13th century Persian philosopher poet, said, "Out beyond right doing and wrongdoing, there's a field, and I will meet you there." To grow and sustain a restorative school, we need to learn how to meet in that field. Before I dig in and share the insights I've learned from my life story to date, I want to acknowledge that what I share today may in a few days or a few years need to change. And I invite you to challenge my thinking as you learn in your particular contexts. I say this because that is what makes it possible for me to speak to you today. My reality that how I first began to understand and practice restorative justice actually continued to cause harm. That's how theory works. It's a framework we work with until we discover something different that leads us to a better place. I also want to acknowledge that I stand on the shoulders of many others who have gone before me and who walk with me now. I acknowledge how the early training I had through IIRP got me started and then confused me. I acknowledge the work of Kay Prentice, Howard Zare, Brenda Morrison, Belinda Hopkins, and so many others who challenge me to think more holistically. Deeper than that, I acknowledge my parents, Garrett and Berendina Grievers, immigrant dairy farmers from Holland to Ontario, Canada, who were committed to their Reformed Protestant faith and introduced me to a God who had created and is present in every square inch of this universe, and introduced me to a Middle Eastern Jewish leader and liberator, Jesus of Nazareth. Sadly, much like Bell Hooks explains, my parents and community modeled for me conditional love, but they did open the way through faith to radical love. I also acknowledge my artist husband, Gerald, and two boys, Chris and Anthony, who live transformation with me and hold me accountable to expectations for being human. And it was my boys, Anthony and Chris, who at about this age actually challenged me to rethink everything I had understood about parenting and teaching, because we found them home with us on a regular basis because they had been suspended and needed to spend a few days thinking. And then I also want to acknowledge the educators whose practice I studied to help me understand restorative justice education, as well as the incredible educators here in Newfoundland and Labrador who diligently and with great commitment embrace restorative justice education as a way of being. And going deeper yet, I acknowledge the reality that this morning, when I woke up, I swung my feet out of bed and placed them firmly on a floor that is directly connected to a foundation built on stolen land. I acknowledge that the land I live on was taken care of for centuries by Indigenous peoples, the Mi'kmaq and the Beothuk, and the Innu and Inuit in Labrador. I acknowledge that I am benefiting daily from a colonizing government's decision to steal, pillage, and initiate cultural genocide in Canada, and similarly, as a Canadian with Dutch DNA in places like South Africa and Indonesia. I live on and benefit from the spoils my ancestors and present-day leaders gained, having deliberately caused harm to others. And each day I live and choose not to find a way to provide restitution for people who have suffered the first harm, as Valandra talks about, I actually continue to cause harm. And so today, I acknowledge that I come with this presentation because of the courage and grace of Black, Indigenous, and people of color restorative justice advocates calling me to rethink the path white Western advocates are paving. Chief Missile Joe and Sylvia Moore, in particular, Fania Davis, and the authors of the very brave book, Colorizing Restorative Justice, which came out in 2020. It is time to magnify the reality that restorative justice is being used to stabilize toxicity and to legitimize oppressive systems, as Sia Henry explains. My story is complex, but no more or less complex than any one of you present today. I don't have the answers. I don't have a refined presentation, but I do have questions I am grappling with. Our lives are intertwined and interconnected. Each one of us causes harm and experiences harm. And let none of us ever believe that we have found the secret to happiness and peace, that we are on the right path and never need to turn around and admit we have taken a wrong turn. I believe today that those of us grounded in a westernized, Eurocentric colonizing heritage are being graciously called back over our well-worn roads paved with individualism, survival of the fittest, and ravaging gluttony to a faint path trodden by peoples who, over generations of oppression, did their best to live a different life. Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and all others who have paid for a first world monopoly of resources and have managed to remain committed to two core beliefs: that all living things are worthy and all life is interconnected. I learned aspects of this early on in my work when a friend challenged my thinking that shifted my trajectory and became the impetus for how I've come to understand restorative justice education and be open to learning from Black, Indigenous, and people of color today. It set me on a course that brings me to today. This story is the first of 4 examples I will give of critiquing various theoretical frameworks that I once held on to firmly. I realize that some of these may actually form the foundation of some of your work. And I'm hoping that my work will have you reconsider some of what you do. Sustainability in schools is dependent on this, but more importantly, human lives depend on it. And then I'd like to also just say that what follows is something that comes out of much of my written work and many conversations I've had with people who have established these, especially early ways of thinking about restorative justice that I think got the field started, but need to be reconsidered. And we need to realize that we are still often too dependent on them. So example number 1, in an article I wrote back in 2013, coming out of my research, I tell this story that woke me up to the reality of power over and power with. I was doing my PhD after 25 years as a primary elementary educator. I was excited to have landed on a topic for my research, the implementation and sustainability of restorative justice in Ontario schools. I was presenting the idea in a seminar class with my peers and started by showing a video clip that outlined the social discipline window. As grad students, we had gravitated towards critical theory to understand the world we lived in. From that, we had learned to ask the questions, in what I do or in what this organization is doing, who is benefiting, who is bearing the burden? And my friend Lisa, in spite of the enthusiasm I was displaying, graciously and respectfully said, but hey, Dorothy, isn't this just another way to control students? Restorative justice might think it's about working with, but just look, even the vertical axis explicitly states control. It's the students who are still bearing the burden. What? I was speechless. My restorative justice bubble burst. I tried to answer, but something inside me told me she was right. Why didn't I see this? Why couldn't I see this? Example number 2. Well, you see, I was an educator, a parent who had been educated and raised to be compliant, to recognize that I had to listen to authority figures who knew best, that I was welcome to be present, but only to be seen and not heard. Now, as a parent and educator, my young charges needed to see me as that authority figure. So I did need to control them. I did need to shape them. I needed to manage my classroom, be sure my children were respectful. And the best way to do this was through power and threat. It was okay for them to fear me. It was for their own good. This quote exemplifies that in an incredible way. Here it is. The fundamental unifying hypothesis of restorative justice practices is that human beings are happier, more cooperative and productive, and more likely to make positive changes in their behavior when those in positions of authority do things with them, rather than to them or for them. This hypothesis maintains that the punitive and authoritarian to mode and the permissive and paternalistic for mode are not as effective as the restorative, participatory, engaging with mode. I began to ask, is this radical love? Or is this recolonizing? I took Lisa's words to heart and began to examine the very theory that I felt had transformed my parenting and teaching, and in essence, it had at least begun that process. I started to listen to myself when I spoke with my sons, when I used the framework questions and I caught myself setting boundaries and explaining that I was happy to work with them if they understood the boundaries. I would support them if they worked within the boundaries. Otherwise, we'd have to move to the 2 box. I heard myself being very supportive with the student who had withdrawn and seemed stuck. I wanted them to succeed. I wanted what was best for them. After all, if they didn't, I had failed. I had convinced myself that I was doing things for them, for their benefit, but in essence, very deep down, I knew it had as much or more to do with my own needs. And when I collected data for my research, I found exactly the same thing. Educators and administrators who had had training but could not shake the reality that restorative justice was not about being in control. One administrator I observed was passionate about how much difference restorative justice had made. So few office referrals, so many less suspensions. And then I heard her tell a class of grade 6 students while pointing to a diagram of the social discipline window hanging on the school classroom wall, "We want to work with you. But if you don't want to work with us, then we'll move to the 2 box." Several days later, after tracking down the child who had thrown wads of wet paper towels around the boys' washroom, over the intercom announced, "We've caught the culprit and justice will be served." What was happening? What is happening that people so passionate about a new way of being in schools can be so blind to their own defaults? What was happening that at home I thought more about accountability than support when it came to ensuring my sons delivered the paper on time? The theories that that had so attracted to me at first began to crumble as I found that how literature circulating in education circles was talking about restorative justice. It was actually reinforcing hierarchies and privilege. And this meant that restorative justice was being used as a tool, not as a way of being, a tool to perpetuate colonizing attitudes. Example number 3, the incredible insistence that we drop the term justice when we talk about restorative justice education. Though I understand the concern that the term has many connections to judicial context, why do we support the use of the term social justice? What's our hesitation to teach clearly that the term justice means to honor the worth and interconnectedness of all? Recently, Meisha Win explains it in this way, and I had hoped to show you this video link, but it's too complicated and the sound doesn't come through, but check it out. And it starts at minute number 38. But Meisha and her partner, Tori, say, when we talk about restorative justice as a program, that's limited. When we think about it as circles, that's limited. Restorative practices has taken over education. If we don't keep justice in it, we lose the reason for our work. Justice is not a dirty word. Justice is who we are as people. Now, early on in my work, as some of you know, I have described the term justice as our magnetic north, our reference for keeping us focused, that when we are doing restorative justice, we are working to restore dignity, worth, and interconnectedness. So, is dropping the term justice a way of recolonizing, or is it an example of radical love? Example number 4. This is probably very familiar to many of you. The primary, secondary, tertiary levels of restorative justice education. I loved this framework at first. It made so much sense. And the percentages along the sides were so convincing. But I found myself asking, in this, who is benefiting? And who's bearing the burden? Why should we focus on relationships? Just because someone says it's good, what we need to do, what is at the foundation of this perspective? Without knowing the foundation, do we risk recolonizing? These are 4 examples of popular theories and perspectives of restorative justice in education that I am pointing out as being flawed. There are more, many more. But using these as examples, we can examine what is at the core of the concerns in each. So 2 things emerged for me as I took a look at these. The first is that advocates for restorative justice, including myself, were committed to fixing problems, to fixing problem people. We are committed to changing the behavior of others, not ourselves, not recognizing that there is no other. We are committed to maintaining control of someone else's territory. And secondly, that we had no idea that the etymology of the term justice was to honor the worth and dignity of all people. I realized that I was deeply embedded in a neoliberal, imperialistic, capitalist mindset that elevated the individual and diminished community. In response, during my doctoral work, I began to wade into what I came to realize in Western circles is a taboo subject, a subject that with the onset of public education especially has been relegated to the private life of people, the spiritual realm. What's that taboo subject? What do we believe about who we are as human beings? This is an area in which we were making and are making all kinds of harmful assumptions. And so I dug deeper. I began to draw on the work of indigenous peoples and various faith traditions and discovered perceptions of justice and well-being that were starkly different than what was assumed in the communities I was a part of. And so I began to understand that the seed of restorative justice are very specific beliefs about humanity. And those beliefs are that all living things are worthy, all are relational and interconnected, and that our well-being is nurtured by one another. And out of these seeds grow key values, values of respect, dignity, and mutual concern. And there are many other values, but most of them can fit under the category of one of these, where respect is to look. So our spectacles, to look again from the other's perspective, by Dominic Barter, where dignity is worth that has no substitute. So if I wasn't here, if you weren't here, another person could take your place, but they would never become you. So dignity of a human being is worth that has no substitute, as Immanuel Kant talks about. And then finally, mutual concern, where we come to a point where there is reciprocal caring for one another. And then finally, the confusion with the term could be resolved in this way. And I draw on Nicholas Wolterstorff's work for this, around primary justice, where primary justice is about nurturing the worth and interconnectedness. And it's present in social relationships when no one is wronged, when the worth of the other is placed at the forefront of our attention, like social justice. And then secondary justice is actually re-establishing worth and interconnectedness. It addresses the situations where wrong or harm has occurred. Without this foundation, without this seed, I found it next to impossible to move away from thinking about restorative justice as a tool. It was next to impossible to get people to stop using the words behavior and restorative justice practices in the same breath. Without this seed, the neoliberal, individualistic, and capitalistic attitudes held tight. But with it, the triangle changed. I asked, what's at that foundation of this perspective? And drawing specifically on Buber, Bianchi, and Wolterstorff, I could answer that an emphasis on relationships comes from understanding that human beings are worthy and interconnected, not objects, but living, breathing human beings. But then I thought about it and I thought, rather than a hierarchy of relational actions, I began to think of them as happening all at the same time, parallel actions. And so I turned the triangle on its side and thought about the proactive and responsive in the whole school to the 1 to 5%. And I still wasn't happy with this. And so Kathy Evans and I revised this further and actually discarded the whole triangle altogether when we wrote the little book of Restorative Justice in Education. And we created this Venn diagram where the belief of who we are is central. And there is holistic understanding that each of these responsibilities, creating just and equitable learning environments, nurturing healthy relationships, and repairing harm and transforming conflict, belongs to every person, an aspect of schooling or community equally. Harm and conflict is not relegated to the 1 to 5% alone. And then the social discipline window transformed and became the relationship matrix or the relationship window. The key change were in the axes, where support was support for being human, and expectations were about expectations for being human, where high support and low support were about, I am going to honor you as a living, breathing human being with dignity, or I don't believe that you are as important as I am. And high expectations and low expectations, I will expect from you and from me that we only do that which will demonstrate worth and being interconnected, that what we do impacts the lives of everyone around us. Low expectations are you can do what you want because it doesn't matter what happens to you. It has no impact. And then I started to think about this more recently in terms of what's really going on in these different quadrants. And so in the context of colonization, I was asking, in the 4 box, is it really our fear of loneliness and rejection that is happening? In the not box, is it our fear of attachment that is taking over? In the 2 box, is it our fear of scarcity for self? And are all these fears foundational to colonization? A fear of losing power? And then how? How do we move then into love, where we grow to understand unconditional, radical love, where there is no other, and we work for the liberation of all? And then this definition, I believe, is the epitome of patronizing colonization. Can we simply get rid of it completely and commit to never using it again? Restorative justice education, like Meisha Wynn, all of my work insists on centering the term justice because it's who we are as people. And in this way, ensuring that it is defined in every single diagram or idea that we have created or will create. Over the years, I have lived with and thought critically about these things, always asking who is benefiting, who is bearing the burden. Over the years, I didn't stop causing or experiencing harm. I'm human, I'm imperfect. But you know what? I was less afraid because I knew what I had to do. I knew that my response would move me towards healing and not further harm. And as the years passed, this has actually stood the test of time, at least so far. And this summer and fall, when the world watched the greatest democracy pretty much disintegrate before our eyes, though saddened, I was not surprised. The US had functioned for generations, not accepting that all people were worthy and interconnected, that Black lives had never mattered, that Indigenous lives had never mattered, that Latino lives had never mattered, refugee lives had never mattered. When a society elevates some and requires that others be subservient, it can only become weaker and weaker. The relationship window, the term justice, the Venn diagram, all serve me well in my personal life. But it also serves me well at this point as I seek to understand racism, prejudice, and systemic oppression. When this can be held up in all these, when we begin to hear the same perspectives are embedded in various groups, different races, faiths, genders, we know we are onto something and dealing with a philosophy and theoretical framework that is at least a little closer to the truth. But why is theory important? Well, if the soil is toxic, if the foundation is faulty, no matter how great the seed, no matter how perfect the walls and the roof, the plant won't thrive and the house will fall. If in restorative justice education, we are not explicitly intent on radical love, the liberation of the other, then let's face it, we are intent on control and causing harm. We are intent on recolonizing. Ursula Franklin says, peace is not the absence of war, it is the absence of fear. Restorative justice moves us from colonizing fear to radical love. Dr. Cornel West says this, in the practice of radical love, you are embracing human beings across the board, but you do give preference to the least of these, to the weak, the vulnerable, and that includes poor whites and poor browns, as well as the poor in Black ghettos. In conclusion, I reiterate that my thoughts are not refined and that they are in flux, As I have challenged frameworks that are dominant in the field, I invite anyone to challenge and deepen the frameworks I am suggesting. Let's work. Let's work on this together. Let's interrogate our whiteness and get out of the way so that those who know rejection, marginalization, discrimination can lead those of us given to recolonization. Let's imagine for a moment, what would happen if instead of fearing harm, fearing the loss of power, and then recolonizing, what if we shifted our focus and learned what it means to be human, how to use our freedom and imperfection to meet together in relationships of radical love, where there is no other. Thank you. In addition to this video, I will post some of the supporting documentation that I've referred to in this presentation. I want to thank you all for taking time to listen, and I trust that what I've shared with you today is both challenging, uncomfortable, discomforting, but also inspiring. And it has been a pleasure and a gift that you have taken this time to be with me in this space.